Dear students, last week we discussed about the characteristics of organisms under the 8th unit in grade 10. Due to the prevailing condition, we thought of teaching the biology lessons first for the convenience of understanding, and therefore we thought of discussing the 13th unit, the world of life. So, if we think of the organisms living around us, you can see there is a huge diversity among those organisms. In grade 6 onwards, you have learned that there are 3 types of living organisms: plants, animals, and microorganisms. And you have got a particular idea about all these 3 groups of living organisms, and you know there is a huge diversity among the organisms existing in all these 3 groups. So here in this lesson we are going to discuss first about classification of organisms. Why is the classification important? What are the different types of classifications? And after that we will learn about each and every group that we have classified, and you will be able to learn the characteristics of organisms belonging to each group. Finally, you will learn about binomial nomenclature of organisms as well. So in the first video, I thought of sharing knowledge about the characteristics of organisms. First, I will mention about classification. Then we'll move on to the 3 domain classification, and today I thought of discussing about domain archaea and domain bacteria. So if we move on to the lesson, here you can see the screen. There, first we have to think about the origin of living organisms. So it is believed that the life has been originated about 3.6 billion years ago, and so far about 8.7 million species of organisms have been identified. So you know, in grade 9 also you have learned how life has been evolved on Earth. So it is accepted that the life originated as unicellular organisms, and thereafter complex multicellular organisms were evolved gradually. So first unicellular organism, it has been evolved in liquid medium, and gradually they have invaded the land. So this evolution is the process in which these simple organisms have been developed into complex multicellular organisms along with time. So this takes several millions of years for evolution to take place, and at this moment also evolution is happening. So in another 100 years, in another 200 years, these existing organisms nowadays have been may undergo certain changes. That is what we call as evolution. Then as I mentioned here, it says the number of species that have been identified so far. So there is a great diversity among these organisms, and once these organisms are grouped, it is easy to study them and to use them for different purposes. Now think you are given a set of pebbles of different colors, different shapes and sizes. Then if you are asked to classify them, you are using certain criteria. So actually I have mentioned the criteria of classification of those pebbles. According to size, according to shape, and according to the color, you can group them. Likewise, there are so many plants, animals, and microorganisms in the living world, and we need to classify those organisms for the convenience of studying about them. That is the main reason for classification of organisms. So we can define the term classification as grouping organisms into different levels. Grouping organisms into different levels based on their common characteristics. Grouping organisms based on their common characteristics into different levels is known as classification of organisms. Then you are asked to mention or state the importance of classification of organisms. They are the convenience of study, easy to study about organisms, ability to identify specific distinguishable characteristics of a given organism. So if you identify a new organism by studying its characteristics, you can group it in the appropriate group, and you can identify the specific characteristics of a given organism when you have a proper classification system. So for example, we are putting the organisms which have similar characteristics in one group. So in that group, the organisms have specific characteristics by which we can distinguish them from the other groups. So another importance of classification is that the ability to identify the specific distinguishable characteristics of a given organism. Then the ability to get an idea about the whole biosphere by studying about few selected organisms without studying each and every organism. Now, if you think about the group mammals, you can name several hundreds of mammals. But if you are asked to study the characteristics of these each and every mammal, it is a very difficult task. Therefore, when you have proper classification, you know if it is a mammal, if this mammal has these particular characteristics, then you have to study only the characteristics common to that particular group only. Then ability to reveal the relationship between different groups of organisms. So here we call it as the evolutionary tree. So at the beginning also I mentioned the life has been evolved as a single cell in a liquid medium. Gradually, because of this evolutionary process, the large number of species have been evolved. So as these all organisms have begun with a common ancestor, common cell, we can study about the relationships among the groups by having a proper classification system. Then identification of organisms with economical uses to human. For example, one of the groups that we are going to learn is bacteria. So there we can learn the common economical uses from bacteria for man. So likewise, about each and every group of organisms, we can learn about the economical uses. These are some of the important factors regarding classification of organisms. There are so many classification systems, but the first classification of organisms was presented by the scientist Aristotle, and a successful classification of organisms was presented by Carl Linnaeus. So in some books you will find this as CARL, Carl Linnaeus. So he is the person who had presented a successful classification system for the first time. So there are different methods of classification of organisms. One such method is artificial classification, then the natural classification. So we learn about artificial and natural classification separately. In an artificial classification, we are just considering the external features, the color of the organism, shape, size, likewise the external features and the habitats where they live, whether they are living in water or whether they are terrestrial and organisms. Likewise, we are considering the habitats, external features for an artificial classification system. In an artificial classification system, the evolutionary relationships are not depicted. So, actually, an artificial classification is not that successful. For example, if we take plants, we can classify them as ornamental plants, herbal plants, poisonous plants, likewise, or by looking at the external features, we can call it as a shrub, a tree, or a creeper, likewise. So that is not that successful. And if we take animals, we can by considering the external features, we can classify animals with wings and animals without wings. But if you think of an example, now the domestic fly also has wings and the birds also have wings. So based on this criterion, we will have to classify both the domestic fly and a crow in the same group. So it is not that successful. Therefore, we have moved on to a natural classification system. By using a natural classification system, we can learn about the evolutionary relationships among organisms and the morphological features. Morphology is the external features, physiological features, the internal functioning, cytology, that is the study of cells, and molecular biological features, that there we are considering the genetic material as well. So all these are considered in a natural classification system. Therefore, it is clear that a natural classification system is much more successful. Organisms are grouped into taxonomical levels in a hierarchy. Hierarchy means there is an order. So if we think about the hierarchy of an organization, there are senior level executives, likewise from those people to the lower level staff, there is a hierarchy, there is an order, there are different organizational levels. So when we discussed about characteristics of organisms, if you can remember, we mentioned about the cellular organization. There also you learned the organizational levels. Likewise, in classification also we find different organizational levels. That is why what we call as the hierarchy. And if you go through your textbook, you will find that you are given the taxonomic levels of modern man, modern human, that is Homo sapiens sapiens. It has been classified under domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, and species Homo sapiens. Just go through that. You don't need to revise all this. And then in a natural classification, organisms are grouped into taxonomical levels in a hierarchy. Then what are the important factors regarding a natural classification system? Specific features of a natural classification are natural relationships among organisms of the same species are explained. What are the relationships, natural relationships among the organisms of the same species that can be explained by using a natural classification system? If I repeat, natural relationships among organisms of the same species are explained in a natural classification system. Then, the evolutionary relationships among different organisms can be explained by using a natural classification. The evolutionary relationships among different organisms can be explained. So these are the different methods of classification. Then we are discussing about natural classification methods. Under that, there are different systems of classification. So first there is the 5-kingdom classification, which was presented by Robert Whittaker. So according to his classification, the organisms were classified into 5 kingdoms known as Monera, Protista, Fungi, Plantae and Animalia. But here we are going to learn about the 3-domain classification presented by Carl Woese. According to the classification of Carl Woese, the 3 domains are domain Archaea, domain Bacteria and domain Eukarya. So we'll move on to that particular classification, the 3-domain classification. Here you can see how the organisms are classified according to that. Here it is shown that there is a common ancestor. So from that common ancestor, 3 main domains have been separated. Domain Bacteria, and here from the same branch of this evolutionary tree, 2 branches have occurred, domain Archaea and domain Eukarya. Then here again a different type of representation. So here domain Bacteria and domain Archaea are considered to be prokaryotes, and then these 4 groups, or we can call them as kingdom Protista. Under that, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Animalia and kingdom Plantae are coming. So here Bacteria and Archaea are belonging to prokaryotes, and Plantae, Protista, Fungi and Animalia, these 4 kingdoms are classified as eukaryotes. So we'll learn about these terms. First, domain Archaea. The organisms belonging to domain Archaea are single-celled microorganisms. They are prokaryotic. Prokaryotic means they don't have an organized nucleus, and they don't have a nucleus which is bound by nuclear envelope. So in Unit 6 you have learnt about the structure of the nucleus. It is a double membraned organelle, but in prokaryotes we don't find such organized nucleus. then they have the ability to live in extreme environmental conditions. So we can find them in extreme, very harsh environments like volcanoes where the temperature is very high, deserts, hot springs, ocean beds where the temperature is very low, and high saline environments where there is a high salinity, and polar ice caps. Likewise, we can find the microbes belonging to domain Archaea in very harsh or extreme environments. And they don't have any membrane bound organelles. They don't have any membrane bound organelles. They are not sensitive to most antibiotics. And they perform anaerobic respiration. They perform anaerobic respiration in order to produce energy. We'll learn about these terms as well. So some examples are given: methanogens, halophiles, thermophiles. These are certain examples for the microorganisms belonging to domain Archaea. So I already have answered the first one, who are prokaryotes. The organisms which do not have an organized nucleus are known as prokaryotes. Then what is anaerobic respiration? It is the respiration without using molecular oxygen. They don't use oxygen gas for their cellular respiration. That is why we call it as anaerobic. The opposite is aerobic. Then what are antibiotics? Antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections, and they don't have any effect on viral infections. So actually an antibiotic is a substance produced by one microbe that selectively inhibits the growth of another microbe. A substance produced by one microbe that selectively inhibits the growth of another microbe is called an antibiotic. So most of these organisms belong to Archaea are not sensitive to those antibiotics. That means they cannot be destroyed using antibiotics. That's all about domain Archaea. Then we'll move on to domain bacteria, the second domain. So this domain consists of both bacteria and cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are also known as blue-green algae. Actually it is not algae, but we call them as blue-green algae. And these are also prokaryotic. So remember, if you can remember the chart first I told you, showed you, there you can see that bacteria and Archaea are prokaryotes. Right, so domain Archaea and domain bacteria both consist of prokaryotic organisms. And remember, the organisms in domain bacteria are sensitive to antibiotics. That is why when we get a bacterial disease, we are given antibiotics. And domain bacteria is the most abundant group of organisms. Domain bacteria consist of the most abundant group of organisms. That means the diversity is very high. There are so many individuals who belong to this domain. That is why we call it as the most abundant group of organisms. So these organisms in domain bacteria are unicellular. The body consists of a single cell. Then they exhibit both autotrophic and heterotrophic nutrition. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs are there. So in Unit 8 also I explained how the organisms are classified according to their nutrition. There were autotrophs, heterotrophs, then autotrophs were further divided into photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. So most bacteria are chemoautotrophic, and cyanobacteria are also autotrophic. There are certain bacteria which will exhibit heterotrophic nutrition as well. So they have a wide range of habitats. They live in air, water, soil, in and on the bodies of other organisms. Again, there is a wide range of habitats. Then if we consider the reproduction of the organisms of domain bacteria, mostly they perform asexual reproduction. For example, bacteria carry out binary fission. This single cell gets divided into two, binary fission. And cyanobacteria can undergo fragmentation. The body gets fragmented and new fragments can survive as different individuals. And budding also takes place. That means certain buds arise and these buds get detached from the body and they are developed as new organisms. But remember, these are unicellular. Then there are different shapes for both bacteria and cyanobacteria. There you can see the round shaped bacteria are known as coccus, and there are rod shaped bacteria which are known as bacillus. A number of round shaped bacteria in a chain, then we call it as streptococci. And when there are two round shaped bacteria, we call it as diplococci. Likewise, they are given different names according to the shape. And in addition to that, there are comma shaped bacteria which we call as vibrio, spiral shaped ones, spirillum and spirochete. There are different shapes. And cyanobacteria also exist as single cells. Sometimes they exist as unbranched filaments and sometimes they exist as branched filaments. Then you can just study this electron microscopic structure of a typical bacterial cell, but you are not supposed to learn about this in detail, just for your understanding. So you can see there are flagella for locomotion and there are plasmids which carry some of the genetic material. Then there is an envelope as the outermost cover. Then there is a cell wall, but this is different from the cell wall of the plant cells. And there is a cell membrane and these pili. They use these for attachments. Cytoplasm, nuclear material, DNA molecules. You can see there is no organized nucleus, and in the cytoplasm there are ribosomes. So this is an electron microscopic image. It is a typical structure for a bacterial cell. Then we'll move on to uses of bacteria. So here you can see production of dairy products like curd, yogurt, cheese. There are bacteria like lactobacillus become important. Separation of fiber from coconut husks and agave leaves, which we call as hana. So these fiber get together because of pectin. So the pectinase enzymes secreted by those bacteria become important to separate those fiber from each other. And tanning of leather, which are the skins of different animals. Fixing of atmospheric nitrogen to increase soil nitrate level. You have learnt about these in grade 9. There are nitrogen fixing bacteria which will help to increase the nitrogen level in soil. Then to decompose dead bodies and structures. So you learnt in the 8th unit that bacteria and fungi are the main decomposers, as these are helpful to decompose dead bodies. It is so much helpful for us because decomposition of garbage is something very important for the survival of all the other organisms. And production of vinegar, acetobacter, then produce vitamins in the body like vitamin B12. And for biotechnology, these bacteria are so much important. This biotechnology is useful in agriculture, medicine, and so many other fields. Then production of antibiotics is also carried out by using these bacteria, some of the bacteria. And there are medicinal uses such as producing probiotics, which are important to maintain the healthiness in our tummy. So there are so many important features regarding bacteria. There are certain harmful effects as well. So for example, causing disease to humans and other organisms. There are so many bacterial diseases in the world. They will cause unfavorable effects on man, other animals, as well as certain plant varieties. Then food spoilage is another harmful effect of bacteria. As the last part of this, I have asked to name some of the bacterial diseases caused to man. So you can say tuberculosis, TB, pneumonia, diarrhea, tetanus, leprosy, whooping cough. Likewise, there are so many bacterial diseases. So I will stop there for the first session, and in the coming lesson I wish to discuss about domain Eukarya. Under that, kingdom Protista, kingdom Fungi, and kingdom Plantae will be discussed. Then as the third unit of it, I will discuss about kingdom Animalia. Under that also we can further divide it into two sessions, invertebrates and vertebrates. So you can go through your textbook, read it carefully, and I will share this note as well. So you can read the textbook and complete your note.